special circumstances, but I would like to respond to something he said about the breaking the arm and that kind of thing. He said that God doesn't have to inflict pain to bring about the absence of suffering. God could just create the absence of suffering to prevent suffering. That is probably true, but in my analogy, breaking my son's arm, of course, would prevent some kind of suffering in the future. But what's broken in us that needs to be rebroken is our character and who we are. And I don't believe that God can take a free moral agent and just inflict him with righteousness if he doesn't want to be a righteous person. I believe that God can give that person incentives to turn that direction and can soften them and make them more sympathetic with what's right through various kinds of trials. But what God's trying to bring about is that which he can't bring about without suffering, because he's dealing with people who have to make their own decision. And the suffering is part of that methodology, in my opinion.
Yes, sir. A question. I have two questions. So one has to do with the representation of evolutionary theory, and I think you sort of misunderstood the point about the euthyphro argument. The other is a more visceral question. It does regard this problem of evil stuff. I guess you can tell me that there are hurricanes because we fell from grace in the Garden of Eden, and the weather went bad, I guess. Right? But don't you ever worry about it? Right? During the 30s, when Hitler youth were being trained, right, they were trained by being told to raise puppies. Right? And they raised them into dogs, and then they were told to execute the dogs. Right? And they were told this. They were told, you don't understand this now. This doesn't make sense to you now, but someday it will. Someday you'll understand the mysteries of blood and soil, and it will. Right? How do you know you're not doing the same? Don't you worry that you're doing the same thing when you can find an excuse in principle for any degree of suffering that exists in the world?
So, in other words, the alternative is that God is not a good God, God's an evil God.
No, that's not. The idea is that, right now you're relying on faith. Right? You're relying on faith when you assume that some story can be. The thing about the Hitler Youth is this, right? They were violating the tenets of their own immediate, phenomenal, felt moral consciousness when they killed dogs. Right? They were being asked to do something which was against the present tenets of conscience. Right? And they did it in the belief that in the long run it would be part of this cosmic story in which would make some kind of sense. Right? Don't you ever worry that you're doing that?
No, I don't. Why? Well, because I believe that the evidence for my belief is rational. I believe it's objective. Of course, I've made several references to my own subjective experience, but I'm not arguing from my subjective experience. I'm testifying to it, but I'm saying that my arguments, by which I test my subjective experience to see whether it's rational or irrational, is compelling and objective.
If right now, 800 million people are starving to death, right? And you can look at that, and I bet, right, you're not able to tell the story, right, that makes sense of this, right? You don't worry.
I might be able to, because if I was one of those people starving to death, I would feel the same way about it as if someone else is, because I really do feel their pain, believe it or not. But I also feel my pain, and I accept that too. What I accept is this, that death is a part of every life. There's never been a person born who either has not died or is going to die, unless we happen to be living in the last generation and Jesus raptures the living saints or whatever. But I'm not counting on that being the case. And so, all people die. If someone says, well, why did God let them die in a hurricane? I guess I'd like to say, well, how did you want them to die? If you say, why did God let me die in an accident? Well, how did you want to die?
I don't want them to die with parasites in their bellies.
I don't either.
In screaming agony for weeks.
What I really want, since death is inevitable for everyone, what I want is for everyone to die prepared to meet their God. That's what I want. And that's what I'm going to work on, because I can't stop them from dying. If I could stop all hurricanes, I wouldn't stop those people from dying who died in a hurricane. They die another way. The ratio of death to human life is 1 to 1. There's a 100% mortality rate of the human race, and therefore it's always tragic when anyone dies. Even Jesus cried at a tomb because it was a tragic thing. Even though he intended to raise that man from the dead at that very moment, He saw death as a tragic intrusion in the human story that he intends to remedy in the end, and that's what he came to do, to defeat death. And I personally think that every death is tragic. But let's pull ourselves together here and say, okay, it's tragic. Sadly, we're all going to die. Let's see if we can do something about A, making life better for those who are still alive, and B, trying to get people prepared for what's going to happen to them when they die, because it's going to happen.
Okay, this bears upon a question before, right? The question, I mean, you asked Bill if there was anything that would happen, right, that would convince him that his theory about the origin, nature, and destiny of the universe are false, right? And he said there are tons and tons of things. He trotted them out, right? He asked you the same question, right? And now you're giving the same answer. I mean, there is no amount of suffering you could ever see that would make you, there's nothing that could disconfirm this story.
That's true. That's true. But I'll tell you what. He said, is there anything that could convince me that God doesn't exist? He didn't say, is there any amount of suffering? You see, all suffering fits into my worldview. There has to be something that is not explicable in my worldview. In fact, that's the thing. Everyone has a worldview. The question is, does your worldview really account for everything, or are there things that it cannot account for? It might seem convenient that a Christian can account for everything, like saying it's the will of God or whatever. But hey, if that is a consistent explanation with an otherwise rationally held worldview, don't knock it. If you've got a worldview that can't account for the origin of life, or the origin of information, or the origin of moral absolutes, then maybe you should change your worldview.
Can I go on to the second?
Yeah.
The second thing is this, right? I mean, the way the debate constantly goes with regard to the evolutionary stuff is this. I mean, you point to, right, the evolutionist who's not able to tell some part of the story, right? And you say, well, I can fill it in. God did it. The thing is, that's not an explanation, right? It's not even close to being an explanation.
It's not a scientific explanation, it's an explanation. But to say that you need to have a scientific explanation for a supernatural fact is imposing artificial rules on the discussion.
It seems like if you say it's supernatural, you're just saying it's inexplicable.
No, I'm saying it's explicable in supernatural terms, not inexplicable.
If you want to talk to him afterwards, that's fine. You have any response to that?
No.
Can you ask them afterwards?
Greg, also a question towards clarification. You gave three of your more prominent arguments was the eyewitness of Christ's disciples or apostles. And you gave a criteria that kind of set apart those eyewitnesses to other common religious testimonies. I think you mentioned Mormonism, Islam, and whatnot. So clarifying, because you mentioned martyrdom, eyewitness, I'm taking that as firsthand experience, willing to testify of these things. Are there other criteria that you feel sets the Christian New Testament witness aside or apart from other witnesses?
I feel, although I gave the strongest because they are the strongest, but yeah, I believe that the documents of the New Testament, especially the Gospels, are unlike legendary documents. They contain factual information that only an eyewitness would give that has no direct bearing on the story itself. It basically makes all the heroes, except Jesus, stupid, including the men who are testifying, declare themselves to have been stupid. And it reveals their lack of faith, their dullness. It's not the kind of thing that hero stories is made of. Legends don't usually do that. I mean, these guys who started the church, who after Jesus was gone, were supposed to be respected. All the descriptions of them are as a bunch of dullards when Jesus happened to be with them. They don't tend to curry great respect for them. They sound like true accounts in that they're honest admissions of warts and all of the people that they're describing.
Okay, so if you were to list criteria that would need to be met, because as was pointed out in the debate, many people could claim that this day or some supernatural fact, and as you said, it needs to be eyewitness, multiple individuals, multiple witnesses willing to die or lay down their life for this. What other than that do you feel sets the Christian witness apart from the other?
Well, frankly, I think that's a lot in itself. but
Or any other criteria?
I'll tell you this. I've done myself. I've spent many years studying the scholarship behind the Gospels and so forth, and the whole of what I've studied inclines me to believe that I'm reading the witness of people who really were telling what they believe to be true. In a court of law, the testimony of similar witnesses would have to be taken as true because it can't be disproven, and it is